Okay. Can everyone see my slides?
Shiraz, this is one of my favorite type of wine.
Ah, this is one of my favorite type of friends.
Okay. Yeah,
So
this is a typical thing, there is a word, and what comes to my mind when I look at Shiraz is one thing, and when you look at that, it comes another thing, So
it's totally different saliency.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
When I look at it right, I think about, Shiraz, one of my favorite types of wine, that is grown in Australia. In Australia, you can find the best Shiraz, but in Spain as well, and in the northern part of Spain, you can have good Shiraz. But apparently today we're gonna take Shiraz as a name, yes?
Yep.
Oh,
So this is an interview with a multilingual, Shiraz. This assignment was fantastic because I got the opportunity to spend some time catching up with a friend from undergrad. And at the same time, I got some great insight on the mind of a multilingual, particularly on the ways in which her lived experience aligns with many of the topics we've touched upon in class discussions and our readings. So this interview was conducted over about 2 hours, during which I posed, according to my count, about 36 questions to Shiraz about her thoughts, feelings, and experiences relating to her multilingualism. I hope you'll find what she had to say about multilingualism as interesting as I did. So without further ado, this is my lovely friend Shiraz. I'd actually like to give her an opportunity to introduce herself. So Shiraz.
Hi, my name is Shiraz Beltran. I am 26 years old.
Were you all able to hear that? I played that off of my phone. Kind of. That was just her voice. I just wanted to give you a sense of what she actually sounds like. So she is 26 years old. Her full name is Shiraz Beltran. She was born and raised in Los Angeles County in California. And until she left for college, that's where she lived her entire life. But she regularly took trips to see and stay with extended family in Algeria growing up. She has her BA in biochemistry, her MS in biomedical science policy and advocacy, and she's currently doing a fellowship in an agency that is related to the Department of Health and Human Services. She was born to Algerian parents who immigrated to the US. Her parents, Gania and Abdel, are both multilinguals themselves, and they made a point to raise Shiraz as multilingual as well. This brings us to the 3 languages that Shiraz speaks. So Shiraz speaks 3 languages, Darija, which is a North African dialect of Arabic, French, and English. So her dominant language is English, although interestingly, she stated that her English was not technically her first language. So her parents made a pact when she was born to speak only French and Arabic to her, which I'll touch on in greater depth later. And it wasn't until she was exposed to English by the community that she began learning English. However, because she was born in a community where English is the dominant language, and because she had difficulty recalling a time when she wasn't able to use English, I would describe Shiraz as being a simultaneous multilingual. Since after talking to her, it sounds as though there was only a very mild delay between when she was introduced to Arabic and French and when she was introduced to English in a regular, meaningful way. So she was not able to recall any specific ages when she was introduced to any of her 3 languages, which to me indicates that it must have been before the age of 3. And I think this fact makes classifying Shiraz as a simultaneous or sequential multilingual a little sticky if we go off of what the textbook and De Hooer had to say about the age of acquisition. So Shiraz is surely a simultaneous bilingual in terms of her Arabic and French, right? But what about English? De Hooer specified that the cutoff point should be no more than a month after birth. So is it possible that Shiraz is both a simultaneous and a sequential multilingual / bilingual? Shiraz wasn't able to provide, through no fault of her own, more specific information about her age of acquisition. And to be fair, even if she could, the fact that she was in a predominantly English area means, in my mind, that she did slide under that month mark that De Hooer claims. In the hospital that she was born, in the grocery store, who is to say that wherever Shiraz went with her parents in LA, that she wasn't being exposed to English until she finally came to the play groups and friends where she personally believes she really began to absorb English. I mean, we could say that she was already in the process of acquiring the language since that's what she ultimately attained as her dominant language. So, this is a family portrait of Shiraz with her parents. So Shiraz is an only child, and her parents are both educators, now retired. Her father, Abdel, previously was an ESL teacher, and her mother, Ganya, taught French at the same school Shiraz went to for K through 12, as well as math. So both Abdel and Ganya speak Arabic and French, and both learned English later in life. When they came to the US, Ganya did not actually speak English. She later picked it up living here. The father, Abdel, did know English before coming to the US. So regarding the pact that I mentioned earlier, her parents made a conscious decision to speak to Shiraz only in Arabic and French. Her mother tried to only use French, and her father tried to only use Arabic to speak to her. But this was not a strict opal approach, right? This was not strictly one parent, one language, because when I questioned her about languages of the household, Shiraz noted that once she was older and judged to be conversational by her parents in those two household languages, they were less particular about using only Arabic or only French. They would often code mix or translanguage using Arabic and French, and then later English to communicate with one another. So in fact, Shiraz communicated to me that there was a point where her mother was concerned that Shiraz would be behind in English compared to her peers. But her father reassured her that Shiraz would very quickly absorb it from everything around her. And this is completely in line with what we've seen from numerous case studies with regards to community languages. And isn't Shiraz so cute there? So regarding literacy, Shiraz has said that she is fully literate in English, which is evident from her impressive academic history. She's reasonably literate in French and not very literate, bordering on illiterate in Arabic. She said that she could read a novel or write a sentence in French, but not in Arabic. So she was formally educated in English literacy, as well as French literacy in school, although she reported that she was essentially illiterate in French until she got to high school, and noted that she had to really focus and train herself to learn the French rules of grammar and conjugation in a formal setting. She was sent to a Sunday school for Arabic and Islamic studies, where she learned the Arabic alphabet and some standard Arabic vocabulary. However, as was touched upon in another bilingual interview for this class, one does not write down dialects in Arabic. And so this has made becoming literate in Arabic a challenge for Shiraz because she does not speak standard Arabic. And without more intensive formal schooling, she never acquired it. She mentioned that she practiced reading road signs when she was in Algeria to bolster her ability to read the alphabet. And today she follows some accounts which use Arabic on Instagram and is able to piece together some of what the captions are, but that is the extent of her literacy. Arabic is challenging in that way because you essentially need to know two types of Arabic to read and speak, and they can sometimes be very far apart from one another in terms of intelligibility. And this is particularly true when it comes to the North African dialect that she speaks, which I will talk about more later in the presentation. So I spent some time during our interview probing Shiraz about what she remembers about her multilingualism as it was developing. So I asked her if she had any memories of being aware of her ability to use different languages to communicate. And when I did, she told me a very interesting story that I'm just going to read as I transcribed from our interview. Before I do, though, I do want to address roughly how old she might have been when this took place. So in this story, baby Shiraz is in a high chair, but she's eating solid foods and using verbs with nouns in simple utterances. And that indicates to me that she must have been beyond the holophrastic stage of language acquisition at this point. So we might say that she was between the ages of 18 and 30 months. She didn't have an exact age for me when she told me this. So Shiraz says, "I don't even think it's my memory. It is a story that my parents told me when I was like a literal baby, a toddler. I was apparently in my high chair and I was asking for milk. And I was asking for milk in Arabic. And the word for milk in Arabic is halib, but you can also feminize it. And so when I was a baby, my mom would call it haliba. So I called it haliba. Now, the Arabic word for grape is aniba. So I was asking for milk, and I think it was my dad was just messing with me by purposefully misunderstanding haliba as aniba. So I would say atani haliba, which means give me milk. And he was like, aniba? Grapes? You want grapes? And I would be like, no, haliba. And he'd be like, aniba? And then apparently, out of frustration, I switched to French and I said, le lait. I think this story is fascinating because in it, Shiraz does something that we just read about in the textbook. She demonstrates her knowledge of translation or linguistic equivalence because she is able to discern the connection of the semiotic meaning of haliba and le lait to the item of her desire, milk. Although her father was just messing around with her, she saw that her attempts to communicate were failing by her perception in Arabic, and so she switched to French. So this is literally textbook. We just read about lexical development in bilingual children for class this week, and she's violating that one particular constraint that says, once a child learns a label for a particular item, they won't use another label for that item. So she's able to analyze and discern that these are two different words to refer to the same thing. So the story also demonstrates that although her parents opted to separate early use of the two household languages by parent, this was not a strict system because Shiraz noted that her mother would call milk haliba, even though her mother theoretically was the parent who opted to only speak French. So this just further underlines the fact that they did make an attempt to make sure that there was an even amount of exposure for both languages, but they weren't being extremely strict about it in their own practice. So on that topic, another one of the questions that I had asked was what were her memories of growing up in a household with an opal-like structure? Because although her parents didn't stick with that wholly orthodox approach, there were periods when her mother would notice that Shiraz was beginning to favor one language over another, and then attempt to counteract those effects, saying things like, we're only using Arabic now. At which point, her mother would refuse to acknowledge what Shiraz was saying in either French or English, that Shiraz recalls responding to with frustration. So one thing that came up as we discussed Shiraz's three languages were her personal feelings about them and how that has affected the way she has learned and used each language. As I mentioned in the last slide, Shiraz experienced strong emotional responses, which were specific to her Arabic use. The frustration that she described when her mother insisted on using only Arabic is connected to Shiraz's trips with her family back to Algeria when she would visit extended family. She said that around that age of 8, quote, I was getting really self-conscious of my accent when I spoke in Arabic. And I didn't know that I had an accent when I spoke in Arabic until I started getting comments about it from my extended family when I go back to visit, end quote. She later went on to say that, quote, I tried to speak with them in Arabic. They would definitely react to my accent when speaking, to the point where if I was trying to have a conversation with them, for example, if I tried to ask them a question in Arabic, I would often not get an answer to my question. Their response would just be them repeating what I said in a very exaggerated version of my accent. So I developed this complex around the way that I speak in Arabic, and so I shut down. I didn't want to speak it in front of the people who spoke it anymore. So I stopped speaking, and my mom was trying to counteract that. I was extremely frustrated because I hated the idea of showing my accent when I spoke. I wanted to read that quote in full because I don't think summarizing with her family nitpicked her accent fully communicates how deeply this affected her feelings about speaking Arabic and how strongly she felt about it. Shiraz also expressed frustration that this happened because she feels as though it occurred at an age when she was still developing her language, and therefore her refusal to speak Arabic negatively impacted her development of that language. And at the same time, though, when I asked how she feels about, or how she felt about being multilingual as an adolescent, Shiraz said that she enjoyed being able to speak multiple languages, that it made her feel cool, and that she felt good about her ability to do so. So during our interview, Shiraz spoke a lot about the languages, how the languages she speaks inform her identity. And she spoke about the paradoxical feelings of otherness that they play into across the many cultural spaces she's found herself in. She noted that North African Arabic, is often seen as, quote, impossible to understand by the rest of the Arab world. So as such, she reported having a difficult time tapping into the Arab community at Columbia when she was in college, because dialects like Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian, and Jordanian Arabic were less intelligible to her and left her unable to use her own dialect to communicate with them. So that forced her to use English instead, which she felt created a divide. And at the same time, she also struggled to find a place within college clubs like the African Students Association, because she is not of sub-Saharan African identity, and was even told at a meeting by a man that, quote, I don't count as African. He said, you're not African if you're not sub-Saharan, which is ridiculous. Algeria is literally a part of Africa. North Africa is Africa. So during the interview, she communicated then, because she felt so othered in all these different spaces, that her ability to speak Darija Arabic contributes to a large part of her sense of self and her place in the world. She embraces her multilingual identity and views it as a benefit, noting that in spite of these issues of feeling somewhat disconnected from the rest of the larger Arab world due to the dialect she speaks, that she also feels all three of her languages allow her to communicate with a much larger portion of the world population than if she was a monolingual. She also believes that speaking languages which are so different from one another as French and Arabic are, has fostered a broad perspective on what is normal in the world. And that, for example, even learning alphabets as disparate as those for English and French versus Arabic helps her to acknowledge how fluid normality is and normalize the idea of different experiences. Her ability to speak Darija is also incredibly important for her sense of self and Algerian identity. So she related watching a film called Papi Shah, which was the first time that she ever saw a movie, which was in her dialect of Arabic, and said after watching it, quote, I cried. It was unbelievable because up until then, the foreign, like the Arabic movies that I have seen have either been Lebanese Arabic or more recently in Egyptian Arabic. And Egyptian Arabic, I can pick up more because it is closer to us, but for a very long time, any Arabic movies, I would be entirely dependent on the subtitles. And this was the first time that I was able to focus on the movie and not read the subtitles. So I asked Shiraz several questions about how she expresses herself using these three languages. I asked her which language she dreams in, which language she swears in, which language she thinks in. And I also asked her which language she expresses her love for her parents in. So for dreaming and thinking, she responded that she generally and probably thinks and dreams most often in English. Although if the subject of her dream speaks in French or Arabic, she communicates with them using French or Arabic. And she also noted that if pressed, she would say that she thinks in English, but she feels like it would be more accurate to say that she thinks in concepts as opposed to language. So we had a long conversation about swearing, which is very fun. And in brief, she is apt apparently to throw out any one of the three languages to swear. Like if she stubs her toe, she described it as a roll of the dice. It could be French, it could be Darija, it could be English. Even if she's only in her apartment and not necessarily in a very active multilingual space like her parents' house, where she'd be, using all three at once. She also very interestingly noted that she is comfortable saying certain swears in French and Arabic in front of her parents, but never English. And likewise, her parents have sworn in French and Arabic in front of her, but rarely English. And it has only been more recently in her adulthood that she's ever heard her mother swear in English. And she noted that it feels very unnatural to hear them do that. So over the course of this back and forth about swearing, she demonstrated that she is sensitive to the different levels of propriety pertaining to certain swears in French when compared to English, and told me some funny stories of her high school French teacher basically going red in the face over what the teacher perceived to have been a very spicy phrase that Shiraz said is not really equivalent to the English gloss. So she said something in her French class that, we'd never throw out, in an English class. But according to Shiraz, pragmatically, her teacher was misinterpreting kind of what the actual grade of vulgarity was. At the same time, she was also able to differentiate between low-level swear words and genuinely offensive, inappropriate swears, So words you'd never say in front of your mother, right? There are some swears where maybe you'd say it around family, and there are some that you know that absolutely no, it's total taboo. And she's aware of that. So she has a reasonably well-developed pragmatic understanding of language that I think comes from being fluent. And then finally, on the topic of expressing love, I asked her how she tells her parents she loves them, because we've discussed the emotional core of languages in this class, and I believe also in the pragmatic class that Professor Ketchkes conducted last semester. And I had read a chapter by Grosjean, which was taken from his book Bilingual Life and Reality, called Personality, Thinking and Dreaming and Emotions in Bilinguals. And I was really delighted to see how many of Shiraz's answers aligned with everything Grosjean had written about the bilingual, or in her case, multilingual experience. That chapter inspired this part of the interview. And so Shiraz told me, quote, "If my mom tells me ahebbik, I won't say moi aussi je t'aime, I'll say ahebbik. But if she said je t'aime, I'll say it back in French. Or if it was me starting it, I honestly couldn't tell you. I think that one's a roll of the dice. But if they say something and I'm replying, it'll either be using the language that they were using with me, or sometimes when I don't catch myself, if I'm not really thinking at all, I will slip into English more often." I think that this reflects the fact that although Shiraz is multilingual, the slipping into English is indicative of it being her dominant language and the place where she goes on autopilot. However, it is also clear by the fact that she is not averse to responding to love in either of her non-dominant languages. That means that her emotional connection is not exclusive to her dominant language. It's not inauthentic for her to say, "Maman, je t'aime," back to her mother in French. It doesn't feel like she's not really communicating the meat of that message if she uses French rather than English. How many Shirazes are there? In this class, we've discussed whether a person becomes a different person when they speak another language. So I asked Shiraz what her thoughts were on this, and she responded with the following. Quote, "I don't think that I am a different person between the three languages, but I know that I am a different person to other people in the different languages." So she went on to clarify that based off of the conversations she's had with extended family, she comes off to them as a more timid version of herself, and that the personality portrayed on the outside does not match the one she experiences on the inside. She noted that because she spends a longer time searching for words in Arabic and sometimes French as well, she feels less likely to be as talkative as she is in English, because she is doing the mental calculation of whether it's worth jumping into the conversation and potentially getting tripped up because she can't find a word. She also noted that her ability to speak, quote, "at the tempo my brain works is dependent on my audience having access to the three languages that she speaks, because when she's speaking with her parents who do speak the same type and number of languages she does, they all rely on the most readily available vocabulary to communicate with one another. But when she is forced to step away from an active multilingual mode into either a bilingual or monolingual mode based on her audience, she slows down in order to suppress the active multilingual mode that she feels most comfortable in. So in short, it is not for Shiraz a question of multiple personalities, but ease and performance as factors that interfere with her ability to fully express the singular personality that she feels she always has, no matter the mode or language. So my final question to Shiraz was whether she considers herself to be a balanced multilingual, and without hesitation, her answer was no. She said that she definitely feels as though she skews towards English and is then most proficient in French following that, and finally Arabic. So she noted that although she feels she is fluent in all three, so functionally she is balanced in the sense that she could get along if dropped in a place where she had to rely on any one of the three languages that she speaks, it would not be the same level of ease or comfort, and not the same level of vocabulary either. So the pace of each language would be different, and her accent would give her away. After she answered, I communicated a little bit of what we said about the possibility of balanced bilingualism in this class, and this quote was her response. Shiraz is a person, sorry, let me just read that. I don't think anyone who says that they're a balanced bilingual they're either lying a little bit or has not really thought about it or sat with their bilingualism enough to reflect on it, excuse me. So Shiraz is a person who is deeply reflective with regards to her multilingualism. Over the course of our interview together, she brought up a large amount of historical and political perspectives related to all three of her languages because she cares about them. And when asked if she would ever try to pass on her languages to potential children, Her passion for her languages and anxiety surrounding the challenges of providing adequate exposure and rich input to them was evident. She even said to me that, quote, "I don't think I'm ready to start a family until I know that I am capable of passing down the languages properly." So for Shiraz, language is not merely a mode of communication. It is part of an entire larger sense of self that she graciously invited me to take a closer look at. So I thank her for her participation and her honesty. And that's my presentation. So any questions?
Thank you. That was really interesting. Thanks a lot. Okay, so do you have any questions to Deanna?
Deanna, did Shiraz's parents grow up speaking French?
I believe they both did, although that is not necessarily the standard in Algeria, because you have people in Algeria who never speak French. It's kind of like a prestige language. It's a language of education over there for sure. And it's also got a very bumpy history. So you have people who never learn French or who don't want to use French. But I do believe that based on the way they use their language that Shiraz described to me, they did grow up speaking. Because she said to me in the interview, for her, French and Arabic are inseparable because her parents kind of use them in an almost inseparable way very often.
Nice, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
It was very interesting what she said about why she decided not to use Arabic that often, because she had negative influence in the family.
Did she ever overcome that in any way? Like, did she ever, when she used Arabic with other, and I imagine it was a big, because of the difference between North African Arabic and the other forms of Arabic, did she ever overcome her hesitation in speaking Arabic with any of the groups that she communicated with?
I know she overcame her hesitation of speaking her dialect of Arabic. So she's comfortable speaking it with her parents. She's comfortable speaking it with her friends who are Algerian, who we went to school with. I don't know whether she overcame that hesitation with other groups. She told me a story later about she was at the airport with her mother as an adult. And they ran into a woman, I think the woman was Lebanese. And her mother had this conversation with this Lebanese woman and then had to run off to do something, which left Shiraz alone with the Lebanese woman. And she just kept trying to say like, I'm Algerian. I'm Algerian. That was she was having a really difficult time communicating. So I don't know if it's necessarily hesitation at this point. I think it's just a difficulty because they're not necessarily mutually intelligible all the time. Whereas her mother, I think, is more proficient maybe in standard Arabic and can kind of bridge that gap more than she can.
Right, because I've heard that, again, just anecdotally, that Moroccan and Algerian and Tunisian Arabic are so different. Egyptian is kind of between bridges,
Yeah,
figuratively and literally bridges between the different dialects. So
yeah, that's basically what she said. This, like, she was referring to Darija, which is she called a North African dialect, and she speaks particularly Algerian Arabic, but like you said, there is Moroccan and Tunisian, and they're just far removed from the Levantine, like Shami, which is over in like Jordan, Palestine, etc., versus the Egyptian dialect. And Egyptian, I think, is kind of most in line with standard Arabic.
Yeah, that's the standard dialect. This is supposed to be the standard dialect because
Right.
somehow the North African dialects and then the Far East dialects of Arabic. Yeah. Any more questions?
I had one question for the class, like a discussion question, which was, she came to me talking about when I asked her future children, if she had any, what she would do or what she would do differently from her parents. And she communicated, that she really doesn't want to let fluency die with her, but she's really anxious about being the only exposure point for her kids and whether she'd be able to do it sufficiently and whether that would be a disservice to her children if she tried to pass it on without, for example, being able to teach them how to write in Arabic and give them the standard Arabic. So I guess my question to you all, and especially because some of you, Andy and Roberto, you have children who you are raising to be bi or multilingual, is what would you recommend to her? Because I think that she can do it, and I think it's important that she does it because it means so much to her.
I think that limits some of her choices in life, though. I'm fortunate that my wife and I are both bilingual in each other's languages. And so that gives us a great advantage in raising bilingual children. And I think that's what Shiraz's, what gave Shiraz's parents so much power in their ability to transfer all of that language to her and culture. And so I think, if she's trying to go for that same 3-language track, she's going to struggle. But I think that I think it's almost, if you can, it's almost a crime not to raise your children in a bilingual setting.
Yeah. And she mentioned that. She mentioned the fact that, she doesn't imagine, and she doesn't want to imagine limiting herself to having a partner because they speak the specific dialect that she speaks. What did she say? She said, my dialect is my responsibility. The French she's not so worried about. Darija Arabic. That's I think her main pain point.
So she's really focused on that one language then. That would be the language that she wants, the language that she has difficulty connecting to with her extended family.
Yeah.
In a country that said you're not really one of us.
Well, it wasn't the country, it was just
but the group, right? That the group of students, like whatever it was, they're like, no, you're not really African because you're not sub-Saharan, but that seems to be a general mentality, was my impression. Do you know what I mean though? Like I would have expected the French to be what she would want to carry over rather than.
I think the reason why she has complicated feelings about the French is, first of all, she's not worried about the French. She feels very comfortable in the French. And she also has complicated feelings about it because in Algeria, French is a language of colonization. And she is someone who cares very much about that history and very much about what that means for her, because she has an indigenous Algerian identity. She has all these different, aspects of being Algerian. And so I think for her, passing on the Darija is like, it's kind of a philosophical point. Even though she has these conflicts, it's like the conflicts don't make it any less important or valuable for her.
She's a very interesting personality because she has 3 languages, and basically the weakest languages I see right now is Arabic. But as far as her identity, her personality is concerned, basically the core identity is Arabic. So this is something that she is all about. All the others are just additions, and modifications to that core identity. And I cannot imagine that if she gets married and then gives birth to children, she will be able to deny Arabic from them in any way, even if she marries a Russian or whatever, So the point is that is so much in her identity and so defining element of her identity that even if she speaks the language not a very high level, still, that is something that she must keep and she will keep. She never give that up, because that's the defining element of her personality, being an Arabic, so even with the slides that you show, how she looks like, how she dresses and whatever, of course, but the information that you gave us about her shows that, well, she is an Arabic person. That's the core of her identity, and all the other factors only modify that identity in one way or another. By the way, I'm glad that you presented her, because she agrees with all the things that I talk all the time.
It was unprompted. I asked her all these questions, and then I'd be like, wow, your dream subject, Shiraz, you just keep saying the things that we talk about in class. But
that's what complex bilingualism is all about.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I said to her, this is the last thing because I know that we probably have to go soon, is that I think that even if it's all about goal setting when it comes to passing along this Arabic dialect, right? She may not be able to raise her child to be a person who can get a PhD in Arabic necessarily, unless that child opts to pursue that for themselves. But she can give them the core of a language that is useful to their actual life: food, love, communication. Those are basic principles that she can still pass, even if she can't write it, even if it's only intelligible within her family, you know, the theoretical grandparents and the extended family. And that's enough, I think, in some ways, if that's the goal that she's comfortable with.
I agree with it. Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. All right, so we deserve a break. We're gonna